They grabbed her by both arms in the middle of the hospital lobby, two security guards in full view of patients, nurses, and a waiting room full of frightened faces, and dragged her toward the exit like she was a problem to be disposed of. Nurse Mara Voss didn't fight. She didn't scream. She said 4 words quietly to the man who ordered it. "You will regret this." Director Harlan Stote laughed. 37 minutes later, a convoy of military vehicles rolled into the parking lot of Callaway Medical Center, and the soldier who stepped out first, a decorated Army general, stopped dead the moment he saw the woman being shoved through the front doors. He didn't salute the hospital. He saluted her. Before this story goes any further, if you've already felt something watching this, follow along until the very end. Like this video and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all started. The day they fired Mara Voss began the same way every bad day at Callaway Medical Center began, with a meeting no one had been properly warned about, held in a room that smelled like recycled air and quiet resentment. She had been on shift for 11 hours when the page came through. Not an overhead announcement, not a message through the nursing station. A handwritten note delivered by an administrative assistant who wouldn't meet her eyes. Report to Director Stote's office. Immediately. Mara read it twice, tucked it into her scrub pocket, and finished updating the chart she was working on before she moved. That was her first mistake, apparently. Not dropping everything and running, Callaway Medical Center sat at the edge of Drennan Falls, a mid-sized industrial city that had seen better decades. The hospital was the largest employer in the county, which meant Harlan Stote, the man who ran it, operated with a particular kind of unchecked confidence that comes when an institution depends on you more than you depend on it. He was 61 years old, former pharmaceutical consultant, and had never spent a single day in direct patient care. He wore expensive watches and talked about operational efficiency, the way a man talks about something he loves but doesn't fully understand. Mara had worked at Callaway for 6 years. She had come in as a trauma nurse, risen quietly to charge nurse of the emergency department, and developed a reputation that said more than any formal commendation could. She was the person you wanted when things went wrong. Not the loudest, not the most political, the most effective. She was 39, with dark hair she kept pulled back so tight it looked like a deliberate refusal of softness, and eyes that had been described by various people over the years as unsettling, steady, or intelligent, depending on who was doing the describing and how much she'd rattled them recently. She knocked once and entered without waiting for an answer. Old habit. Stote was behind his desk. To his left stood Dale Pruitt, the head of hospital security, a broad man with a flat expression and a security chief's particular talent for making rooms feel smaller. To Stote's right sat a woman from Human Resources named Pamela Greer, who had a legal pad in front of her and the look of someone who had already written the ending. "Close the door," Stote said. Mara closed it. "Sit down." She sat. What followed was 7 minutes of the most carefully constructed institutional betrayal she had ever witnessed up close. And she had seen more than a few. Stote laid out the accusation in the even, pleasant tone he used for budget presentations. An inventory discrepancy in the emergency department supply room. Controlled medications, emergency trauma kits, IV materials. Roughly $40,000 in supplies that were, according to the hospital's records, unaccounted for. Mara had flagged the discrepancy herself, 3 weeks ago, in writing, submitted to both administration and the Pharmacy Oversight Committee. She pointed this out. Stote nodded like she'd said something expected. "We're aware of your report. What we're also aware of is that you had keycard access to the affected storage units during the relevant time period." The silence in the room had a particular texture. Pamela Greer was writing something. Dale Pruitt hadn't moved. "So did 14 other staff members," Mara said. "Yes," Stote agreed, "but those individuals don't have a pattern of insubordination on record." He opened a folder. Inside it were 3 disciplinary memos from the past 4 years. Each one, as Mara remembered clearly, generated in response to her refusing to approve unsafe patient discharge timelines that administration had pushed for to free up beds. We've had concerns about your attitude toward institutional protocol for some time. She looked at the folder. She looked at Pamela Greer, who still wouldn't look up. She looked at Dale Pruitt, who looked back with the blank focus of a man who had been told to be present and nothing else. You're accusing me of stealing supplies that I reported missing, Mara said. We're presenting findings, Stote said. HR has reviewed. I want a union representative in this room before this conversation goes further. Pamela Greer finally looked up. Your employment status makes that. I know my employment status. I'm charge nurse, not a contractor. Get me a rep or end this conversation. Stote leaned back in his chair and studied her for a long moment. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He smiled. Not warmly. The way you smile when the outcome was never actually in question and you've been tolerating the pretense of process as a courtesy. Your access badge has already been deactivated, he said. Security will escort you out of the building. You'll receive formal written notice within 72 hours, with instructions for contesting the decision through the appropriate channels. I suggest you take that route. A pause. It will be faster than litigation. She stood up slowly. She had the strange sensation she sometimes got in high-stakes trauma situations. A complete and eerie stillness inside while everything around her accelerated. She picked up her bag. You're making a mistake, she said. Harlan Stote was already looking at his next document. Dale Pruitt personally walked her down. He didn't grab her, not yet. He matched pace beside her through the administrative corridor with the body language of a man who would prefer this to go quietly and had resources available if it didn't. The nursing station staff on the third floor watched her pass. A few of them. People she'd worked beside for years. People whose kids she knew by name. People she'd covered for during the worst nights. Looked down at their charts. Not all of them. A traveling nurse named Santos held her eyes and gave her a nod that said, I know, without saying anything. A student nurse named Della looked like she might cry. Mara kept walking. At the elevator, Pruitt spoke for the first time since the office. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I don't think you did it. She looked at him. Then you should have said that 20 minutes ago. He didn't answer. The elevator opened. The lobby of Callaway Medical Center was its public face. High ceilings, donated art, a fountain that probably hadn't worked in 2 years but still looked decorative when visitors first walked in. 40, maybe 50 people in the waiting area at this hour. Parents with kids, an elderly man with his arm in a sling, a teenager in a hoodie who'd been there longer than anyone else, staff crossing back and forth, the kind of cross-section of a city that only hospitals reliably produce. 2 security guards were waiting near the main entrance. Mara recognized both of them. Hendricks was newer, probably 6 months in, and wouldn't meet her eyes. Trent was older, ex-police, and had asked her twice in the break room whether she thought he was developing type 2 diabetes. She had told him honestly that yes, the symptoms he was describing probably warranted a glucose test, and had printed out the relevant information for him without being asked. Trent stepped forward and reached for her arm. That was when she understood how completely this had been scripted. Not improvised, not reactive, but planned in advance. Stage directions and all, because Harlan Stote was not a man who left room for variables. Ms. Voss, Trent said, and he at least had the decency to sound uncomfortable. We're going to need to walk you out. People were looking now. You couldn't not look. 2 uniformed security personnel escorting a nurse through the main lobby. It had a theater to it, an ugliness that was probably intentional. Public humiliation is a management tool used by people who want to set an example. Mara didn't resist. She walked between them toward the exit doors with the quiet of someone who has decided that the situation speaks for itself. The waiting area was silent. She heard someone whisper behind her. She couldn't make out the words, but felt the weight of it. At the doors, Hendricks pushed them open. Outside, the parking lot was gray and cool, a Thursday afternoon in early November in Drennan Falls, and the light had that particular flat quality that industrial cities get when the sky can't decide whether to commit to clouds or not. Don't come back without an appointment, Trent said. He wasn't unkind about it, but he said it. The doors swung closed behind her. She sat in her car for 11 minutes, not crying, not calling anyone, just sitting with the engine off and both hands in her lap, processing. This was a thing she had learned to do a long time ago, in conditions that made a parking lot in Drennan Falls look perfectly manageable. The ability to let the shock pass through you without letting it flatten you. She had been in worse places, significantly worse, and she had moved through those. She took out her phone and called her attorney, a civil litigator named Raymond who had helped her with a contract dispute 2 years ago and had told her to call him if Calloway ever pulled anything. She got his voicemail and left a precise, unemotional message. The accusation, the timeline, the written report she had submitted 3 weeks ago, the fact that her access had been revoked before any formal process had been completed. She gave him the specific date of every interaction she could recall. Then she hung up and sat a moment longer. She thought about the supply room, about what had actually been missing. The inventory discrepancy she had reported wasn't random. It wasn't the kind of thing that happened from poor documentation or misplaced shipments, though those things did happen. It was specific, high-value emergency kits, the kind used for field triage and mass casualty events, the kind that weren't restocked through normal pharmacy channels, the kind that came from federal emergency preparedness grants and were supposed to sit untouched until the hospital needed them for a disaster scenario. They were gone. Not misplaced, gone. She had checked. Twice. She had put it in writing because she was thorough, because that was who she was, and because some part of her professional training, deeper than nursing school, older than Calloway, knew that you documented everything because eventually the moment comes when the documentation is all you have. She started the car. She'd go home. She'd pull together every email, every time-stamped record she had access to from her personal devices, and she'd hand it to Raymond and let the legal process do what it was built to do. She had the patience for it. She wasn't going anywhere. She had just pulled out of her parking space when the convoy arrived. Thought. She saw it in her rear-view mirror first, the leading edge of it, a pair of black military transport vehicles moving through the hospital's main access road at a speed that didn't match normal traffic. Then more behind them. 3, 4, 5 vehicles. One of them a command unit, all of them bearing the kind of government markings that don't belong in a hospital parking lot on a Thursday afternoon unless something has gone very seriously wrong or someone has made very specific inquiries. Mara stopped her car. She watched in the mirror as the convoy organized itself across the front lot. Soldiers in field uniforms stepping out with the controlled economy of people who know exactly where they're supposed to be. One figure stepping out of the command vehicle, Tim, tall, fit, mid-50s, a bearing that doesn't develop from behind a desk. She recognized him before she could see his rank. General Douglas Fane, Army Medical Corps. The man who had once pulled her out of a collapsed field station with his own hands and a level of calm she hadn't believed possible until she saw it happening. She watched him turn, scan the front of the hospital, and stop when his eyes found her car. Even from 30 yards away, across a parking lot, with her sitting behind a windshield, he found her. Because people like Douglas Fane developed that ability through years of needing it, and it didn't switch off. He said something to the officer beside him. Then he started walking toward her. Mara got out of the car. "Meet. You look terrible," she said, when he was close enough. "That's fair," Fane said. He had lines around his eyes that hadn't been there the last time she saw him, and something tighter in his jaw, but he was still fundamentally himself. A man built for moments of high consequence, currently standing in a hospital parking lot in Drennan Falls, looking at her like the universe had just made an unexpected but not entirely unwelcome correction. "You want to tell me why you're here?" she asked. "I want to tell you a few things," he said, in order of urgency. "First, you're going to need to come back inside that building." She looked at the hospital. "They just fired me." "I know what they did." His voice didn't change, but something behind it did. "Second thing, we have a problem 30 miles east of here. Hartwell Chemical Processing Facility. Something went wrong in their secondary containment unit about 40 minutes ago. We're still getting full scope, but preliminary numbers suggest 40-plus casualties in the first wave. More incoming." He paused. "And this is the closest Level 1 capable trauma center." Mara went very still. "How many critical?" she asked. 15 at minimum. Chemical exposure, blast trauma, 3 or 4 of them are going to be surgical if they survive transport. She turned back to the hospital. The lobby doors, the waiting area visible through the glass, the woman at the admissions desk who had definitely been watching the parking lot. Third thing, Fain said quietly. She looked at him. I went through the supply manifest your hospital filed with the Federal Emergency Preparedness Office 6 months ago. I did it tonight before we came here because when a trauma center is your closest option, you want to know what they've got. He paused. What they reported and what they actually have don't match. The cold that moved through her had nothing to do with the November air. How bad? She said. Bad enough that if the incoming casualties arrive without supplemental military medical support, people die who don't have to. She thought of the storage room, the specific, deliberate absence of the emergency kit she had documented. The meeting she'd sat through 3 weeks ago where 2 different administrators had told her the discrepancy was being reviewed. The memos that Stote had used as proof of her insubordination, each one generated because she had refused to let institutional convenience override patient safety. She looked at Fain. There are ambulances coming right now? First wave ETA is 17 minutes. She didn't say anything else. She picked up her bag. She walked back toward the hospital entrance, and Douglas Fain fell into step beside her, and the soldiers behind them moved as a unit, and the doors opened. Chat. The lobby stopped. Not all at once, but in the sequential spreading way that a room stops when something enters it that the room doesn't know how to process. First, the security desk. The young man there looked up and started to stand and then looked at the uniforms and sat back down. Then the admissions staff. Then the waiting area, one person at a time, the woman with the toddler, the teenager in the hoodie, the elderly man with the sling. Trent was still near the entrance. He saw Mara first, and his face did something complicated. Relief and guilt arriving at almost the same time. Then he saw Fain, and the uniforms, and the complexity in his expression got significantly worse. Ms. Voss, he started. Get out of my way, Trent, she said. Not angry, just direct. The voice she used when there was no time for anything other than what needed to happen next. He got out of her way. The admissions manager, a woman named Sheila, who had worked the front desk since before Mara had arrived at Callaway, stood up from behind her station. Mara, you can't be... Your badge. Call the ED charge nurse, Mara said, already moving. Tell them I need a full triage status, and I need it in the next 4 minutes. Tell them to activate mass casualty protocol if they haven't already, because they're about to get a chemical exposure event. Sheila stared. Then she reached for the phone. Dale Pruitt appeared from the corridor to the right. He must have been watching from somewhere, or someone had called him the moment the military vehicles showed up. He saw Mara. He saw Fain. He looked at Mara again with the expression of a man whose earlier statement, I don't think you did it, was rapidly acquiring new weight. Her access needs to be restored, Fain said to Pruitt, with the calm specificity of someone delivering an order that expects compliance. Right now? Pruitt looked between them. I don't have the authorization to... Then get me whoever does, and get them to me in the next 60 seconds, or I make a call to the county health authority, and we have a very different conversation about what this facility is and isn't capable of handling. Something shifted in Pruitt's face. He pulled out his radio. Mara was already past him. She knew these hallways the way you know your own hands. Without looking, without thinking, just moving through the space with the certainty of someone who has done it thousands of times, in thousands of conditions. Left at the pharmacy corridor, right at the radiology junction, through the double doors into the emergency department. It hit her all at once. The sound of it, the organized chaos that every ED operates inside during a normal day. And she could already see that normal was fraying at the edges. The charge nurse on duty was a man named Teruel, solid and experienced, and he was on the phone with both hands braced on the nursing station counter like he was trying to hold it down. He looked up and saw her, and the specific quality of his relief was hard to describe, except that it was the kind that arrives when a situation has exceeded the available competence in the room, and something has just changed. Tell me where you are, Mara said. 6 critical holds, 2 surgical pending, 3 trauma bays active, 1 bay down because the monitoring equipment crapped out an hour ago, Terrell said, talking fast. And I just got paged that we have a mass casualty incoming, chemical exposure, ETA. 12 minutes now, Mara said. How are we on airway management supplies? The pause that followed was a fraction too long. Terrell. We're low, he said. I put in a request 3 weeks ago, and it came back with an approval flag, but the actual restock never. How low? He looked at her with the eyes of someone about to deliver genuinely bad news. If we get 15 or more critical airways, we're going to run out before we stabilize them all. Mara turned. Fane was 2 steps behind her. He'd followed her through without asking permission, and no one had tried to stop him. Your medical unit, she said. What are you carrying? Enough for a forward operating base, he said. Full trauma load. I need your airway supplies integrated into our triage staging. Bay 3 is down. We can set it up as a supplemental trauma station if your medics are credentialed for... They're credentialed, Fane said. Then do it. She turned back to Terrell. Activate mass casualty. Get every available nurse and tech to the trauma corridor. I need surgical to know we have incoming blast trauma. Tell them to prep 2 ORs, not 1. She paused. And someone get me a working monitoring set for Bay 3. Terrell was already moving. Overhead, the mass casualty alert sounded. 3 tones. Then the announcement. Then the controlled urgency that descends on a hospital when everyone understands simultaneously that the next several hours will require everything they have. Mara grabbed a pair of gloves from the supply wall. She pulled her hair tighter. She looked once at the lobby visible through the corridor window, at the hospital that had marched her out of this building less than an hour ago. And then she turned back to the emergency department and she went to work. She didn't hear Harlan Stote arrive behind her. She didn't see the way his face changed when he walked into the ED and found the military personnel integrating their equipment with his staff, and his charge nurse following a woman whose badge had been deactivated 3 hours ago, and a general standing in his trauma corridor giving direct orders to his people. She was already at the first incoming stretcher when the ambulance bay doors blew open. The man on the gurney was 40, maybe 45, face and hands badly burned, breathing in the ragged, working way that means the airway is intact but not for long. His eyes found her face, and she looked back at him with the complete, steady presence of someone who has done exactly this before, in rooms without electricity, in fields without walls, in conditions that made a trauma bay look like controlled paradise. I've got you, she said. Stay with me. Outside, 3 more ambulances were pulling in. Behind her, somewhere in the corridor, she heard Harlan Stote's voice, raised, indignant, saying something about authorization and protocol, and her name said the way people say names when they mean this should not be happening. Douglas Fane's response was short and even. She didn't catch all of it. She caught the last part. And if you interfere with this response, I will have you removed from your own hospital. The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence. The kind that arrives when a man who has never once been challenged in his own institution realizes the coordinates have changed and he is no longer the fixed point. Mara didn't turn around. The patient in front of her needed intubation in the next 40 seconds, and she was going to give it to him. And everything else. Stote, the memos, the badge, the meeting, the grinding institutional ugliness of the past 3 weeks was going to wait. She had work to do. She worked for 4 hours without stopping. Not 4 hours the way people say it when they mean they stayed late at something. 4 hours of sustained, unrelenting clinical intensity in which she made approximately 900 individual decisions, some of them in under 3 seconds, most of them with incomplete information and deteriorating resources, and a trauma corridor that kept receiving new patients before the previous ones had stabilized. She intubated. She directed surgical prep. She called blood types across the bay and had them confirmed before the labs could process. She moved between stations the way water moves, not around obstacles, but through them, finding the path that wasn't a path until she made it one. The man with the burned hands and the compromised airway, his name was Delgado, she found out later from his intake bracelet, was the first one she lost. Not from the burns, not from the blast trauma. He coded 12 minutes into treatment from a cardiac event that nobody could have predicted from the initial presentation, and she ran the resuscitation for 9 minutes with Terrell and a military medic named Okafor at her side. And it didn't work, and she called it, and then she turned around and walked to the next bay because there was no other option and the next patient was already there. That was the part nobody who worked in emergency medicine talked about at dinner parties. The pivot. The wall you hit and then walk through because someone else needs you to, and grief is something you carry in your chest and deal with later, or not at all, or badly, in a parking lot somewhere at 2 in the morning. She dealt with it badly sometimes. She was dealing with it right now by not dealing with it, and that was fine. Terrell watched her turn from that bay and said nothing. He had been doing this long enough to understand that there was nothing to say. The mass casualty intake from the Hartwell facility came in 3 waves. The first wave had been the site workers closest to the initial breach: blast trauma, chemical burns, pulmonary exposure. The second wave was heavier: secondary collapse victims, people who had been attempting evacuation when a structural section of the facility gave way. The third wave arrived around the 90-minute mark and was the most complicated. Mixed presentations, some of them delayed onset from chemical absorption, a category of patient that looked stable on intake and wasn't. And you had to know what to look for, or you missed it. Mara knew what to look for. She had learned it in a context that had nothing to do with Callaway Medical Center or Drennan Falls, in a period of her life that she had closed and locked and mostly left locked. But training doesn't disappear just because you stop using it. It lives somewhere underneath the professional surface, dormant and accurate, and it came forward now without ceremony because it was needed. She caught 2 delayed onset pulmonary exposures that intake had classified as stable. She redirected them to monitored beds with specific observation intervals, documented the reasoning in shorthand that Terrell read over her shoulder and didn't question, and moved on. Somewhere in the second hour, she became aware that Harlan Stote was still in the building. She clocked him at the edge of the corridor, saying, standing near the nurse's station with Dale Pruitt, watching, the 2 of them in a cluster with a woman Mara didn't recognize who had the clipped efficiency of someone from a legal or compliance function. They were talking in low voices. Stote's expression had gone through several phases over the past 90 minutes. Anger, then disbelief, then something colder and more calculating that she recognized as the face of a man who understood his position was threatened and was working out his options. She didn't have time to care. She turned back to her work. It was General Fain who brought it to her attention around the 2-hour mark, during a brief window when the intake had temporarily slowed and the surgical cases were all in the OR and the monitored patients were holding. He found her at the nursing station drinking water from a paper cup and updating charts with her left hand while her right hand pressed against a tension headache she'd been ignoring for 40 minutes. "We need to talk," he said. "About what?" He set a tablet on the counter in front of her. On the screen was a spreadsheet. Supply inventory, federal format, the kind generated by the Emergency Preparedness Reporting System that hospitals like Callaway submitted twice annually to maintain their certification and federal funding status. She looked at the numbers. She looked at him. "This is their last filed report," he said, 6 months ago. She looked at the numbers again. The filed inventory showed full emergency kit stocks, the exact kits that had been missing from the storage room, the kits she had documented, the kits she had formally reported as absent 3 weeks ago. They were listed here as present, accounted for, fully stocked. "Somebody filed a false report with a federal agency," she said. "Somebody filed 2. He scrolled down. The report was countersigned at the bottom. The name in the authorizing signature line was not Harlan Stote. It was Dale Pruitt. Mara straightened up. She set down the water cup. "How far back does this go?" she said. "I've got my logistics officer pulling prior reports. If this is a pattern, if they've been filing false compliance documents with the Federal Preparedness Office and drawing down the actual supplies in between, we're looking at a significant federal fraud situation." He paused. "Not a hospital disciplinary matter, a criminal one." The corridor was quiet for a moment. The overhead lights had the flat white quality of late-night emergency rooms everywhere, aging fluorescent panels that buzzed faintly if you listened, which she usually didn't but was listening to now because it was the sound of a situation becoming something other than what it had appeared to be. "They needed to move the supplies," she said slowly, "and they needed the inventory to look clean." She thought about the timing. 3 weeks ago, her report. Last week, the sudden disciplinary file that Stote had assembled. The memos retroactively framing her as insubordinate. The accelerated meeting, the pre-deactivated badge, the security escort through the lobby. They knew I had documentation. They needed me out before anyone followed up on it. Fain didn't say you're right because he didn't need to. His face said it. "I need everything you have in writing," he said. "Your original report, every email, every communication, whatever you have access to. It's on my personal devices. They didn't get those when they took my badge. Good. He picked up the tablet. I'm making a call. There are federal investigators associated with the Department of Defense Inspector General's office who handle exactly this kind of compliance fraud. They can be here by morning. Stoat has lawyers, she said. So does the government, Fain said, with considerably larger budgets. She almost laughed. It came out as a short exhale through her nose. Not quite humor, but close enough that Fain noticed it, and the corner of his mouth moved slightly in response. Then her pager went off. Not the general page. The specific alert code that meant a patient who had been classified stable was deteriorating. Room 14. One of her delayed onset pulmonary cases. She was already moving. The patient in room 14 was a woman named Teruko, mid-30s, who had been a shift supervisor at the Hartwell facility and had been at the outer edge of the chemical exposure zone during the initial breach. She had walked herself to the ambulance, which was why intake had classified her as stable. The ones who could walk usually were. Mara had overridden that assessment 2 hours ago and moved her to monitored observation, and it had turned out to be the right call, but right calls have a window, and the window was closing. She was conscious when Mara came in. That was the deceptive part about this particular exposure. It kept people conscious while their respiratory function quietly compromised. Can't. Teruko stopped. Tried again. The effort of speaking was taking too much. Can't breathe right. I know, Mara said. She had the monitoring data already. Oxygen saturation dropping, respiratory rate climbing, the specific combination that said intervention was minutes away from being necessary. I'm going to help with that. I need you to stay as still as you can. Kids, Teruko said. The word cost her something. How many? 2, 7, and 9. A pause, labored. They know? Is there someone I should call? My sister, she's got them. Another pause. She knows? I don't know yet. Can you give me her number? Teruko's eyes moved to the right with the effort of trying to remember, and it was the most human thing Mara had watched happen in 4 hours. A woman whose lungs were shutting down, trying to hold on to a phone number. She got it. She gave it to Terrell, who was at the door, and he nodded and left. And she turned back to Teruko and started the intervention. And it went the way it needed to go. Difficult and close, but workable. And 20 minutes later, Teruko was on supplemental oxygen with a respiratory therapist monitoring, and the saturation was climbing back toward acceptable. Mara came out of the room and stood in the corridor for exactly 4 seconds with her back against the wall and her eyes on the ceiling tiles. 4 seconds was what she had. She pushed off the wall and went back to the nursing station. Terrell was there. He had his phone in his hand and the expression of a man who has just made a hard call. Her sister's coming, he said. Good. Mara. He said her name differently that time. Not functionally, but personally. The way he'd said it maybe half a dozen times in 6 years of working together, when something needed to be said that was outside the clinical frame. What you caught tonight, those 2 patients, without you flagging them, we would have... He stopped, looked at his hands. I just need you to know that I know that. She looked at him. He was a good nurse, a genuinely good one, which was different from a competent one, and she appreciated the distinction now more than she had the bandwidth to properly express. I know you know, she said. It was enough. He nodded, and they both moved on, because the department needed them to. She didn't see Stoat approach. She heard him, the specific cadence of expensive shoes on linoleum, faster than usual, with the rhythm of a man who has rehearsed what he's about to say. Ms. Voss, he was trying for authority and landing somewhere short of it. I need to speak with you regarding your continued unauthorized presence in this facility. The patients in this department are stable, she said, without turning around. You're welcome. That's not... Your access has been revoked and your presence here is a liability issue. I have legal counsel who has advised... She turned around then. Something in her face stopped him mid-sentence. Not anger. She wasn't angry, which was the part that probably unsettled him most, because he was clearly prepared for anger and had no frame for the alternative. You filed false federal supply reports, she said. It wasn't a question. The corridor had other people in it, 2 nurses near the medication cart, a military medic charting at the far end. They weren't looking over, but they weren't not listening either. Stote's expression did something she'd seen before in people with institutional power, the brief internal calculation of which response costs less. "I don't know what you think you found. I don't think anything," she said. "General Fain has the filed reports. He has the actual inventory, and he has my documentation from 3 weeks ago." She paused. "The federal investigators he's contacting will have all of it by morning." Stote's left hand at his side closed into a fist, just for a second. Then it opened. "This is going to be very difficult for you," he said quietly. "Whatever you think is going to happen, stop talking, Harlan." It wasn't said loudly. It was said with the flat clarity of someone who has reached the end of their patience with a particular kind of person and doesn't feel the need to dress that fact up in professional language. Stote's mouth closed. Pruitt appeared at the end of the corridor. He saw the 2 of them. He saw Stote's face. Something crossed his own. Not quite guilt, not quite fear. Something in the uncomfortable neighborhood between them. He started to step forward and then stopped because Fain appeared from the same direction with 2 people beside him who were not military and not hospital staff. A man and a woman in plain clothes with federal ID badges clipped to their jackets, who had apparently made much better time than anyone had predicted. The woman looked at the corridor. Then she looked at Stote. Then she said, in the even tone of someone conducting a professional function, "Mr. Stote? I'm Special Agent Dara Wilms, Department of Defense Inspector General's Office. We have some questions about your facility's emergency preparedness reporting history." Pruitt turned around and walked in the opposite direction. Fain watched him go and made a brief gesture to one of his officers, who moved to intercept without being told why and without needing to be told. Mara watched all of it from where she was standing, the corridor, the fluorescent lights, the sound of a patient monitor somewhere behind her, steady and rhythmic. The specific quality of a situation that has crossed from chaos into consequence. Her phone buzzed. A text from Raymond, her attorney. "Got your message. Call me when you can. This sounds like more than an employment matter." Then, 3 minutes later, a second text. "Also, are you okay?" She typed back, "Working." She pocketed the phone. She looked at the corridor, at Stote standing in front of the federal agents, at Fain watching from 6 feet back with his hands clasped behind him, at the hospital that had thrown her out of its doors 3 hours ago, currently reorganizing itself around her absence and her presence simultaneously. Then her pager went off again. Not a patient, a code. Trauma Bay 1, the bay she'd assigned to the most critical incoming case from the last wave, a 42-year-old man named Vasquez who had been in the interior of the Hartwell facility when the secondary collapse occurred. She ran. She hit the trauma bay doors at a controlled sprint, and what she found inside was not what she'd left. Vasquez was in arrest. The nurse at the bedside, a younger woman named Prita, who was good but didn't have the years behind her that this moment required, looked up at Mara with eyes that communicated exactly how close to the edge they were. 2 minutes, Prita said. He just... Hands off, I've got it. Mara was already at the bedside, already assessing. She called the resuscitation. She made the adjustments. She worked with the concentrated precision of someone who had done this in conditions that had no power and no roof and no backup, and she did not stop. 3 minutes in, the monitor changed. She did not let herself feel it yet. She called the next steps, confirmed the rhythm, got a pulse check, confirmed again. He was back. Prita exhaled so hard she nearly deflated. Mara put a hand briefly on her shoulder. Not because it was protocol, because it wasn't, but because the young woman was shaking slightly and had just done something hard, and it mattered that someone noticed. Good work, Mara said. You did that, Prita said. We did that. Document it exactly as it happened. She turned back to the monitor. Vasquez's readings were climbing towards something she could live with. She adjusted the medication orders and stood at the bedside for another minute to make sure the trajectory held. It held. She was standing there, watching those numbers, when she heard the sound from the corridor. Raised voices, a door hitting a wall, the particular quality of a situation becoming physical. She stepped out. Dale Pruitt had not, it turned out, simply walked away. He had walked to his office and from his office, he had apparently gone somewhere in the building that he shouldn't have gone, and the officer Fain had sent after him had lost him for approximately 11 minutes. 11 minutes was enough time to access a server room, enough time to attempt to delete records. He had not succeeded. The hospital's backup system, running on a separate server that Pruitt apparently hadn't accounted for, had captured everything. But the attempt had been made, and now Pruitt was in the corridor near the administrative wing with 2 federal agents and a military officer, and the expression of a man who has just run out of runway. He looked, from the end of the corridor, directly at Mara. She didn't look away. She didn't say anything. She just watched him with the steady, patient attention of someone who already knew how this particular story ended, had known since she sat in that meeting with the legal pad and the recycled air and the manufactured evidence, and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. Then Pruitt said something she didn't expect, not to the agents, not to the officer, to her, across 15 feet of corridor. "I want to cooperate," he said. "I want to tell them everything." The agents looked at each other. Mara said nothing, but somewhere in the back of her mind, a very specific thought formed and settled. Whatever Pruitt knows is bigger than Pruitt. And whatever it was, Harlan Stote didn't know his security chief was about to say it. Pruitt didn't get to say it right away. The federal agents closed the distance in 3 steps, and the taller one, the man whose name Mara would later learn was Reyes, put a hand on Pruitt's arm and steered him toward the administrative corridor with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that a witness offering cooperation was a resource to be managed, not a conversation to be had in a hospital hallway at 11:30 at night with 8 people watching. Mara watched them go. Then she turned back to the trauma bay because Vasquez's monitor had made a sound she didn't like, and that took priority over everything else. It was a false alarm, a lead disconnect from when he'd shifted his arm. But she reset it herself and stood there another 2 minutes confirming that his rhythm was stable and his pressure was holding before she let herself step back. The body has a memory for near misses. She could feel the residue of the last hour in her hands, a faint tremor that she knew from experience would last about 20 minutes and then disappear as her nervous system finished processing what her conscious mind had already moved past. Preeta was charting at the bay's secondary station. She glanced up and saw Mara looking at her hands. "That happens to me too," Preeta said, quietly, without making it a thing. "Good," Mara said. "Means you're paying attention." She went to find Fain. He was in the corridor outside the administrative wing, on a call, standing with the stillness of a man who had learned to hold his body completely quiet when his mind was running fast. He saw her coming, said 2 more words into the phone, and ended the call. "Pruitt's talking," he said. "I heard him offer." "He's doing more than offering. He walked Agent Wilms through a transaction record in the first 10 minutes. Cash payments from a third-party logistics company routed through 2 shell accounts to Pruitt's personal bank." Fain's expression was not satisfied. It was the careful neutrality of someone who has confirmed a bad thing and doesn't feel like celebrating it. The supplies weren't just sold. They were sold to a specific buyer, contractor network that resells medical equipment to overseas markets. Not military surplus, not legitimately decommissioned, stolen. Mara processed that. Stote knew. Stote initiated it. Pruitt was the operational end. They ran it for 14 months. 14 months. She thought about that number, about the patients who had come through this emergency department in 14 months, about what it meant to run a hospital's emergency preparedness resources down to nothing over that period, about the specific mathematics of what would have happened tonight without the military's supplemental supplies. "How many people almost died tonight because of what they sold?" she said. Fain looked at her steadily. "Based on the airway supplies alone? At least 4. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the silence didn't already contain. "The problem," Fain said, "is Stote. He's lawyered up in the last 20 minutes. His counsel must have been on standby because she got here faster than should have been possible. She's with him now in the executive conference room. She's advising him not to speak, and she's raising jurisdictional questions about the federal investigator's authority to operate on private hospital grounds. Can she slow it down? She can complicate it. She's good. I've seen the firm's work in other cases." He paused. "There's also a board member here. Someone named Holloway. Arrives 15 minutes ago, before the agents got deep into anything. He's been in contact with the hospital's external legal team. Mara thought about that. Board members arriving in the middle of the night meant someone had made calls. Calls meant information moving through channels that were trying to get ahead of what was coming. Is there anything in the evidence that doesn't go through Pruitt? She said. Anything that doesn't require his cooperation to establish? Bain reached into his jacket and produced a folded sheet. He handed it to her. It was a printout, a delivery manifest from a freight company, time-stamped 11 months ago, itemizing medical supply transfers from a warehouse address in the county. The receiving signature at the bottom was not Pruitt's. It was Stote's. "Where did this come from?" she said. Pruitt kept a copy. In a personal storage unit he apparently maintained specifically because he didn't trust Stote not to make him the sole liability if things fell apart. A pause. Which is what Stote was doing. The disciplinary file they built against you. That was Stote's contingency. If the supply discrepancy was ever investigated, there was a documented paper trail pointing to an employee with a history of insubordination and keycard access. She looked at the manifest, at Stote's signature, at the specific date, which was 6 weeks before she had submitted her report and 8 weeks before the disciplinary file had been assembled. They had been building the exit ramp before she had even triggered the alarm. The moment she had flagged the discrepancy, she had walked into a trap that was already constructed. She folded the manifest and handed it back to Fane. "What do you need from me?" "Your original report, time-stamped emails, anything that shows when you discovered the discrepancy and when you reported it, in your own words, before anyone could have anticipated you'd be looking." He looked at her directly. "The defense will argue that Pruitt is a compromised witness. This documentation is the independent corroboration." "Give me 10 minutes." She went to the nursing station, retrieved her personal phone from her locker. The hospital hadn't thought to ask for it during the exit process, which had been conducted in enough of a hurry that several things had been overlooked, and pulled up her email archive. The original report was there, time-stamped, with the automatic read receipt showing it had been opened by 2 members of the Pharmacy Oversight Committee and 1 administrative assistant 4 floors up. She forwarded everything to Fane's secure email address, which he gave her verbally, and she didn't write down because she had always had the kind of memory for numbers that came from years of needing it. Then she went back to work, because there were still patients in this department, and the fact that the institution around her was collapsing didn't change what they needed. Whoa. The third wave of Hartwell casualties had finished processing by 1 in the morning. 41 patients total had come through Callaway's emergency department from the incident. 37 were stable. 2 were in surgery. 1 had been in surgery for 3 hours and was, according to the last update from the OR, doing as well as could be expected, which was the phrase surgeons used when they meant alive but not out of it. 1 had been transferred to the regional burn center 40 minutes away. 1, Delgado, the first man, the one she had lost, had not made it. The department had a particular quality after mass intake events. Not silence, because hospitals are never silent, but a kind of exhausted steadiness, like a runner at the end of a very long mile. Nurses charting. Monitors beeping at regular intervals. The particular fluorescent hum of a night shift finding its footing after a surge. Terrell found her in the break room at 1:15, which was the first time she had sat down in 5 hours. She was drinking coffee that was too hot and too bad and absolutely necessary. "You need to see something," he said. She followed him back to the nursing station. He pulled up the hospital's internal record system on one of the workstations. His credentials, not hers, because hers were still suspended, a fact that had become almost abstract in the context of the night, and navigated to the supply management module. "Look at this," he said. The screen showed the current supply inventory, not the filed federal report, the real-time internal system. She looked at the emergency kit stocks. Then she looked at the procurement log attached to the account. The history of orders, deliveries, and disbursements going back 2 years. The disbursement column told the story in plain numbers. 16 months of supplies, leaving the inventory at irregular intervals, never through the standard patient use pathway, coded under a blanket requisition designation that was obscure enough that a casual review wouldn't catch it, but specific enough that someone who knew what they were looking for would. "How long have you known about this?" she said. Terrell hesitated. It was a half-second hesitation, but she caught it. "Terrell? I noticed it 4 months ago," he said. "The coding pattern. I flagged it to the supply chain manager. Her name is Greta. She's been here 12 years. And? She told me the coding was a documentation format change from administration, that it was fine." He looked at the screen. I figured if Greta said it was okay, then maybe I'd misread it. She's been here longer than me." Mara looked at him. He was a good man having a bad moment, which was different from a person with bad judgment, and she understood the distinction because she had been in those rooms herself. The room where an institutional authority tells you that what you're seeing is not what you're seeing, and you have to decide whether your own perception is trustworthy. "Did you document that you flagged it?" she said. "I sent an email. I have it. Add it to what we're sending Fane." He pulled it up immediately, which told her he'd known that was coming and had already found it before he brought her here. She forwarded it, then her phone buzzed. Not a call. An alert from the hospital's internal system, generated by whatever automated function sent department-level notifications to charge staff. She still had the app on her phone. The notification said, "Emergency board meeting, 2 a.m., Administrative Suite Level 4. All department directors required." She looked at it. She was not a department director. She was, as of 6 hours ago, a former employee. She went anyway. At Level 4 of Callaway Medical Center was the administrative floor, carpet instead of linoleum, actual art on the walls rather than donated prints, a different quality of silence that came from sound dampening rather than emptiness. Mara had been here maybe a dozen times in 6 years, and each time it had carried the same faint atmosphere of a place that considers itself separate from what happens below it. The conference room was at the end of the main corridor. Through the glass wall, she could see people already assembled. Board members, 2 of the hospital's senior physicians, the CFO, and in the corner, a woman she hadn't seen before who had the specific composed energy of someone managing a crisis from a legal standpoint. Stoat was there. He saw her through the glass before she pushed the door open, and what moved across his face was not anger this time. It was something more closely related to fear. She opened the door. The board member named Holloway, 60s, silver-haired, the face of a man who had run profitable things for a long time, looked at her and then at Stoat and then at her again. "This is a restricted meeting," he said. "I'm aware," Mara said. "Agent Wilms asked me to be here." She looked at Wilms, who was standing against the far wall with Fane beside her, and who gave no indication of surprise at Mara's presence, which was because they had spoken 2 minutes ago in the stairwell, and this had been discussed. Holloway looked at Wilms. Wilms looked back with the specific pleasantness of someone who doesn't need the room's cooperation and knows it. Given that this meeting concerns the operational status of Callaway Medical Center's emergency preparedness compliance, and given that the Department of Defense Inspector General's office has an open inquiry into that compliance as of tonight, we do need Ms. Voss present. Wilms paused. "You're welcome to verify with your legal counsel." The woman in the corner, Stoat's attorney, presumably, made a brief gesture to Holloway that Mara read as, "Don't fight this one." Holloway sat down. Mara took a position standing near the door. She wasn't going to sit. This wasn't her meeting, and taking a chair would have been a choice with implications she didn't want to make yet. She watched. What followed was 40 minutes of the most precise institutional unraveling she had ever witnessed. Wilms laid it out without theater. The false federal filings, the documented supply transactions, the manifest with Stoat's signature, Pruitt's cooperation, and the corroborating financial records, and the independent timestamp documentation from Mara's original report that established the timeline beyond any reasonable alternate interpretation. She didn't present it as accusation. She presented it as sequence. This happened, then this happened, then this, then this. The sequence spoke for itself with the blunt eloquence of documented fact. Stoat's attorney objected twice. Wilms acknowledged both objections with the same professional courtesy and continued. The board members didn't look at Stoat. That was the tell. In Mara's experience, not just medical experience, but the older, harder experience that she had accumulated in the years before Calloway. A room turns against someone before the room admits it. The turning happened in the quality of attention, in who people looked at when a difficult thing was said, in the micro-adjustments of body language that precede conscious decision. The board had turned by the 15-minute mark. Holloway himself had turned by 20. Stoat simply hadn't processed it yet. At the 30-minute mark, one of the senior physicians, a cardiologist named Dr. Renfield, who had been at Calloway longer than anyone else in the room and had the credibility that comes with that tenure, said quietly, "How many patients were at risk tonight because of the missing supplies?" Fain answered. "Conservatively, 4 critical cases that required equipment from our supplemental military stores. Without that equipment, they would have had no airway management at the volume required." "And without the military presence," Renfield said. A pause. "The outcomes would have been different." Renfield looked at Stoat for the first time in the meeting. He looked at him for a long time and then looked away. "I'd like to recommend an emergency board vote on the immediate suspension of Mr. Stoat from all operational authority pending the completion of the federal investigation," he said. "I'll take the motion." Holloway seconded it without hesitation. Stoat stood up. His attorney reached for his arm and he pulled it away. The gesture of a man who had decided he was done being managed. "Everything I did was for this institution," he said. The room was quiet in a way that doesn't offer comfort. The budget pressures this facility operates under, the federal grants that barely cover what we actually need. You think that money comes from nowhere? You think I didn't make choices that kept this hospital open? Nobody answered him. "I kept us solvent," he said. His voice was getting louder in the way that voices get when the argument beneath them has already failed. "Every one of you has benefited from the operational decisions I made. Every—" "Harlan." Renfield's voice was not unkind. It was just final. "Stop." Stoat stopped, and in the stopping, something in him seemed to understand at last what had already been decided, had been decided before he walked into this room, had perhaps been decided the moment Douglas Fain's convoy had pulled into the parking lot and found a nurse standing next to her car in the November cold with 4 words worth of warning that nobody had listened to. He sat back down. The vote was 7-0. Mara left the conference room before the procedural formalities were finished. Not because she didn't want to watch the rest of it. There was a part of her, small and human and not particularly proud of itself, that did want to watch. But she had checked her phone on the way in, and there was a message from Prita. Vasquez's pressure was dropping again. She took the stairs back down to the ED at something between a fast walk and a run, and the administrative floor gave way to linoleum and fluorescence and the particular smell of a working hospital, which she had always found oddly stabilizing, antiseptic and effort, the smell of a place that is actually trying to do the thing it exists to do. Vasquez was awake when she entered, which surprised her. He'd been unconscious through most of his treatment, and she hadn't expected him to surface this quickly. He was a big man who had been made smaller by what had happened to him tonight, propped up with his oxygen cannula in and his eyes tracking the room with the careful wariness of someone reorienting to consciousness. His pressure was dropping because he'd pulled his arterial line in his sleep. Not a crisis. Recoverable. Inconvenient. The kind of thing that happens. She reset it. She adjusted his positioning. He watched her do it with the alert eyes of a man who wanted to ask something and was trying to figure out if he had enough air to do it. "Go ahead," she said. "Are you in charge here?" he said. His voice was rough and very quiet. "Right now, yes." He seemed to think about that. "My guys," he said, "the ones who came in with me. 4 of your coworkers are stable and in monitored beds. 2 are in surgery." She paused. "One didn't make it." She said it plainly because he was a man who worked in an industrial facility and had likely seen things, and plain was a form of respect. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them. "Which one?" She told him the name. He looked at the ceiling. His jaw moved. He nodded once, the nod of someone filing grief away for later in the same way she had, the same mechanism, the human version of moving through rather than around. "Thank you," he said, "for telling me straight." She stayed another minute to make sure the line was holding. Then she stepped out of the bay and stood in the corridor, and the weight of the night settled on her all at once. Not crushing, just present. The accumulated density of 5 hours of sustained consequence pressing down with the honest mass of a thing that has actually happened. She was tired. She was the specific kind of tired that lives below physical tiredness, in the part of you that runs the harder operations. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Raymond, her attorney. She answered it. "Mara," he said. He sounded like he'd been awake for a while. "I've been reading what you forwarded, the timestamps, the emails, the report. This isn't an employment case anymore." "I know," she said. "This is federal. Fraud, theft of public resources, and depending on how the patient outcome piece is argued, potentially criminal negligence." A pause. "Are you safe? Are you okay?" She thought about how to answer that. She was standing in an emergency department at 1:40 in the morning, wearing the same scrub she'd put on 14 hours ago, having been fired and then unfired and then present for the arrest of her former employer, and then almost lost 2 patients and actually lost 1, and her feet hurt and her head hurt, and there was a faint tremor still in her right hand that was taking longer to resolve than usual. "I'm working," she said. It was the same thing she'd texted him earlier, and it was still true, and it was the truest answer she had. He made a sound that was partly exasperation and partly, she thought, something like respect. "I need you to come in tomorrow. There will be federal attorneys who want statements, and we need to prep you before that conversation." "Tomorrow," she agreed. She hung up. She pocketed the phone. She stood in the corridor for another moment and became aware that someone had been standing at the edge of the corridor for the last 30 seconds, waiting without interrupting. She turned. It was Della, the student nurse who had looked like she might cry when the security guards had walked Mara through the lobby. She was holding a paper cup of coffee and offering it with both hands in the way of someone who wants to do something useful and has worked out that this is what's available. Mara took the cup. "Thank you," she said. Della nodded. She looked like she had several things she wanted to say and was deciding which one had earned its moment. Finally, "I should have said something earlier when they walked you out." "You're a student nurse," Mara said. "Still." Mara looked at her. She was 23, maybe 24, with the particular brightness of someone who had come into medicine for the right reasons and hadn't yet had those reasons sufficiently tested. "What you're feeling right now," Mara said, "keep it. The discomfort of having not spoken up. Don't resolve it too fast. That's the thing that makes you better." Della seemed to turn that over, then she nodded again. Differently this time, more slowly. Mara drank the coffee. It was better than the break room coffee by a meaningful margin, and she filed that information away for future reference. Then the lights went out. Not all of them. The emergency generators kicked in immediately, as they were supposed to, and the critical systems stayed on, the monitors, the surgical suites, the major equipment. But the corridor went dark for the 3 seconds it took the generator to bridge the gap, and in those 3 seconds something happened at the nursing station that made Terrell shout, not in alarm, in the compressed, controlled way of a man managing a problem, but loud enough that she heard it from 20 feet away. She was at the station in 4 steps. "What?" she said. "Servers flagging a conflict," Terrell said. He was staring at the screen. "The record system is... someone's trying to access the pharmaceutical records remotely." "From inside the building or outside?" "Inside. IP traces back to a terminal on this floor." Mara thought fast. Pruitt was with the federal agents. Stote was in the conference room with his attorney and the board. That left people she hadn't accounted for. The woman from HR, Pamela Greer, who had been in the original meeting and whose location Mara did not know. The CFO, who had left the board meeting 20 minutes before it ended, citing a phone call. "Lock the terminal," she said. "Call building security. Not Trent. Call whoever Pruitt's deputy is. And get Fain on the phone right now." Terrell was already moving on all 3 fronts. Mara was looking at the access log on the screen, at the specific records being queried. Not financials, not personnel. Pharmaceutical records. Controlled medication dispensing logs. The kind of records that would show, in granular detail, exactly what had been administered to which patient, by which staff member, in which quantities, over any given period. The kind of records that could be used to frame someone. The kind of records that, selectively edited or extracted, could be made to look like a nurse with keycard access had been diverting controlled medications for months. She understood immediately what was being built and why, and for a second the cold of it moved through her with the force of a physical thing. They weren't done. Stoat had been neutralized. Pruitt was cooperating. But somewhere in this building, someone, the CFO, Pamela Greer, a third person she hadn't identified, was executing a backup plan that had been prepared in advance, and the target of that plan was the pharmaceutical record that bore her staff credentials on every shift she'd worked for 6 years. And if those records were altered tonight, before the federal investigation could lock them down, and before she had independent documentation of what they actually said, the case against her would not be an employment matter. It would be a criminal one. Her phone was already in her hand, but before she could dial, the overhead speakers in the emergency department crackled. Not the standard intercom, the emergency broadcast system. And a voice came through that she recognized after 1 second as the hospital's automated system, which meant someone had triggered the emergency broadcast manually from somewhere in the building. The message was 7 words. All staff report to emergency stations immediately. In the 3 seconds of silence that followed, Terrell looked at her. That code hasn't been triggered in 11 years, he said. Her phone rang. The screen said, Fane. She answered it. He didn't say hello. We have a problem, he said. The Hartwell facility. The secondary containment. The initial breach tonight wasn't an accident. What do you mean it wasn't an accident? She said. Pruitt gave us a name 20 minutes ago. Someone outside the hospital. A contact in the Hartwell facility's safety inspection department who had been helping them move the supplies, providing cover documentation, signing off on equipment transfers that were coded as facility maintenance rather than medical inventory. Fane's voice had the clipped quality of a man delivering information he's still processing himself. Pruitt says this contact was getting nervous, wanted out of the arrangement, and 3 days ago Stoat made a call. Mara was walking already, away from the nursing station, putting distance between herself and the open corridor because this was not a conversation for shared airspace. Stoat ordered it, she said quietly. We don't have that confirmed. What we have is Pruitt saying that the contact, a man named Bevins, facility safety inspector, told Pruitt 2 days ago that someone had approached him, told him the inspection records he'd falsified were about to be audited, that he needed to make certain documentation disappear or face federal charges himself. A pause. Pruitt thinks Bevins panicked and triggered the containment breach deliberately to create a crisis that would bury the paper trail in the chaos of an emergency response. She stopped walking. He killed his own coworkers to cover a fraud. 41 casualties. 1 fatality. And if the response had gone the way it should have gone, with this hospital fully stocked as its records claimed, maybe nobody would have looked closely at Callaway at all. Just a disaster response. Community trauma. Clean records. No questions. The corridor was empty in both directions. Somewhere behind her she could hear Terrell on the phone, dealing with the pharmaceutical records intrusion, and somewhere above her the board was still in session, and somewhere in this building a person or persons were at a terminal right now trying to build a case against her out of records that were technically accurate and could be made to look like something they weren't. The pharmaceutical records, she said. Someone in this building is accessing them right now. I think they're trying to construct a medication diversion case against me. Fane went silent for 2 seconds. Who has access to that system outside of clinical staff? The CFO left the board meeting early, and Pamela Greer from HR was in the original meeting with Stoat. I haven't seen her since. Where's the terminal they're accessing from? Administrative corridor, 2nd floor. Terrell's trying to lock it remotely. I'm sending Reyes there now. The sound of movement on his end. Mara, do not go to that terminal yourself. I know, she said. She hung up and stood in the corridor for 1 moment. One deliberate, contained moment in which she acknowledged to herself that this situation had layers she hadn't fully mapped, that there was at least one person in this building still actively working against her, and that her instinct was to go find that person, and that her instinct was wrong. Then she went back to the nursing station, because there were patients who needed her, and the best thing she could do for herself right now was also the thing she did best. Terrell had gotten the remote lock on the terminal. He confirmed it with a look when she came back. the particular nod of someone who has successfully done a technical thing under pressure and is not going to make a production of it. Records are frozen as of 2 minutes ago, he said. Whatever they got to in a 5-minute window. How much can you do in 5 minutes? In a medication dispensing log? He thought about it. You can add entries. You can't delete. The system doesn't allow deletion, only addenda. But if you added false dispense records under someone's credentials, it would look identical to genuine documentation unless you pulled the system's back-end audit trail, which requires IT administrator access. Get IT on the phone. Already did. They're pulling the audit trail now. 20 minutes, maybe. She looked at the clock on the nursing station wall. 2:17 in the morning. She looked at the department, at the patients in the monitored bays, at the steady green lines of the monitors, at Prita doing medication rounds with the particular focus of someone who has had a hard night and is choosing to use it rather than be used by it. She looked at the door to the administrative corridor. I'll be back, she said to Terrell. Fane told you not to... I know what Fane told me. She met his eyes. I'm not going to the terminal. I need to find Pamela Greer. Pamela Greer was not on the second floor. She was not in the HR suite, which was dark, or in the break room adjacent to it, or in the administrative bathroom. Mara checked all 3 in 4 minutes, systematically, with the efficiency of someone who has done building sweeps in buildings significantly more dangerous than this one. She found her in the stairwell, 3rd floor landing, sitting on the steps with her legal pad in her lap and her phone face down beside her, and when Mara pushed the door open, she looked up with the expression of a woman who has been waiting to be found and isn't sure whether that's a relief or not. Pamela Greer was 52 years old and had worked in hospital HR for 20 years, which meant she had spent 2 decades absorbing the institutional logic of places like this one, learning when to push and when to accommodate, and how to frame an untenable thing in language that made it feel procedural rather than wrong. She was not a bad person in the way that Stoat was a bad person. She was a person who had made incremental choices that had accumulated into something she could no longer defend in a stairwell at 2 in the morning. I didn't access the pharmaceutical system, she said, before Mara could speak. I know, Mara said. She didn't actually, not with certainty, but she needed the conversation to move quickly, and she read Pamela's face as someone who needed to confess something, not deny it. It worked. Pamela exhaled. It was Norris, she said. The CFO. He left the meeting to do it. He told me before the meeting that if the board moved against Harlan, there was a contingency. She stopped, looked at the legal pad in her lap. I told him I wouldn't be part of it. He said I was already part of it. A pause. He wasn't wrong. Mara sat down on the steps 1 level up from her, not to be comfortable, but to be at eye level because this mattered. The disciplinary file, Mara said. The memos, were those genuinely from the record or were they constructed? Pamela's hands tightened on the legal pad. The memos were real. You did push back on the discharge timeline decisions. That happened. She paused. But the framing did. The language I used in the summary, connecting them to the supply discrepancy, that was directed by Harlan. He told me how to connect the dots. I connected them. Knowing the connection was false, knowing I couldn't prove it wasn't. She looked up. There's a difference. I told myself there was a difference. There was a difference. It wasn't a large one, but it existed, and Mara wasn't interested in collapsing it because collapsing it served no one right now. Norris is going to be arrested, Mara said. In the next 30 minutes, probably. What Fane's team finds when they pull the access logs from that terminal is going to establish attempted evidence tampering on top of everything else. She paused. You were not at that terminal. No. Then the question is whether you're a witness or a subject, and the answer to that depends entirely on what you do in the next 10 minutes. Pamela looked at her. There was something in her face that was not quite surprise and not quite gratitude, more like the recognition of a known thing arriving later than it should have. You're telling me to cooperate, she said. I'm telling you that you have 1 window to walk through on your own before someone walks you through it. Mara stood. Reyes is on the 2nd floor right now. He's the federal agent, not the military. Plain clothes, ID badge. Tell him what you told me and tell him about Norris. She paused. Tell him Norris directed it. Make that specific. She pushed back through the stairwell door without waiting for a response. The arrest of Kenneth Norris, Callaway Medical Center's CFO, occurred in the second-floor administrative corridor at 2:41 in the morning. Mara wasn't present for it, but she heard about it in pieces, the way you hear things in a hospital in the middle of the night, fragments of conversation through doorways, a shift in the radio traffic from the security channel, Terrell telling her in 3 sentences while she was reviewing a patient chart. Reyes had found Norris at the terminal. He had not yet managed to successfully insert false records. The remote lock Terrell had placed had stopped the active session, and the audit trail IT was pulling would show that the attempted entries had been blocked before they were committed. What it would also show, with full timestamp detail, was exactly what Norris had tried to add, which was arguably more damaging than if he'd succeeded, because it established intent with specificity that a completed falsification would have required deeper forensic work to prove. The audit trail took 18 minutes to generate. Mara read it at the nursing station at 3:10 in the morning, standing next to an IT analyst named Burke, who had arrived in jeans and a jacket over a sleep shirt and was nonetheless completely competent, and what it showed was 11 attempted medication dispense entries under Mara's credentials spread across a 6-month period, all coded for controlled substances, all entered in a 5-minute window tonight. Not subtle, not sophisticated. The work of a man who was panicking and operating without the time to construct something careful. This would never have held up, Burke said, looking at the screen. He wasn't saying it as comfort. He was saying it as professional assessment. Any decent forensic audit would have caught the timestamp clustering immediately. 6 months of dispenses entered in 5 minutes. He shook his head slightly. Whoever did this was not thinking clearly. He wasn't, Mara agreed. He was scared. That was the thing about institutional corruption. When it started to fall apart, it generated its own accelerating pressure. Each person protecting themselves created new exposure for the next person, and the responses became less calculated and more reactive. And reactive people made the kinds of mistakes that careful people would never make. Norris had just made the kind of mistake that ended careers and added charges. She filed the audit trail in her phone's photo archive and texted it to Raymond. He responded in 4 minutes with, "Perfect, go home." She almost laughed. Tug. The board meeting reconvened at 4 in the morning. This one Mara was formally invited to, the invitation delivered by Agent Wilms in person, which told her this wasn't a spectator role. The room looked different at 4 a.m. than it had at midnight. The same people mostly, but with the particular dishevelment of a long night wearing on them. The precise hair now less precise. The board members in varying states of coatless informality, Renfield with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. Stote was not in the room. His attorney had advised him to leave the building after the board vote, and he had, which meant he was somewhere in Drennan Falls right now, in a house that probably cost more than most people made in a decade, waiting for a morning that was going to go very badly. Norris was in federal custody. Pruitt was in federal custody. Pamela Greer had given her statement to Reyes and had been released pending further interviews, which was the administrative equivalent of being on a very short leash. Wilms spoke first. She laid out, in the direct economy of a federal agent who has been awake for many hours, what the investigation had established so far. The 14-month supply diversion scheme, the false federal filings, the contractor network, the connection to the Hartwell facility, and the man named Bevins, who had been located at his home by local law enforcement at midnight and was currently in county custody, his cooperation pending negotiation, the attempted pharmaceutical record tampering, the CFO's role and its failure. Then she said something that brought the room to stillness. Based on what we have from Pruitt and what the financial records are indicating, the total value of diverted medical supplies over the 14-month period is approximately $800,000. She paused. The contractor network that purchased those supplies has been linked to 2 other hospital systems in the state. This is not an isolated case. The silence in the room had a different quality than earlier. Not the silence of shock, the silence of scale, of understanding that what had happened at Callaway Medical Center tonight was not a local story. Holloway, the board chairman, said, "How many facilities?" "We're still mapping it. At least 2 confirmed. Potentially 5. Renfield took his glasses off his forehead and put them on the table and looked at them for a moment. "What happens to this hospital?" he said. "That depends significantly on what this board does in the next 48 hours, Wilms said. Full cooperation with the federal investigation, transparent internal review, immediate remediation of the compliance failures. Those are the factors that will determine whether Calloway faces institutional liability or is treated as a victim of the scheme. She paused. The individual actors, Stote, Norris, Pruitt, are separate from the institution. The board has the ability to make that separation clean. Holloway looked around the table. Something had shifted in him since the earlier meeting. The silver-haired operational authority had given way to something more human and more tired. He looked like a man who had arrived tonight believing he was coming to manage a problem and had discovered instead that the problem had been living in his institution for over a year without his knowledge. "What do we need to do right now?" he said. "Tonight." Wilms nodded toward Mara. Everyone in the room looked at her. She had not planned to speak. She had come as a witness, and witnesses were supposed to be largely passive, and she had enough of Raymond's legal caution in her head to know that speaking in an unofficial capacity in front of a board in the middle of an active federal investigation was not advisable. She spoke anyway. "Reinstate my credentials," she said, "effective retroactively to the time they were revoked. Not as a gesture, as a documented correction, with the record showing that the revocation was made in bad faith as part of a deliberate scheme to suppress a legitimate employee report." She looked at Holloway directly. "That goes into the official record tonight, before your legal team has time to soften the language." Holloway looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Renfield. Renfield said, "Moved." The vote was 7-0 again, but it felt nothing like the earlier 7-0. The first had been the board removing a man. This one was the board acknowledging a wrong. Dawn came the way dawn comes to industrial cities. Not dramatically, just gradually, gray light pushing against the darkness in a process that seemed less like sunrise and more like the night running out of energy. Mara was in the parking lot at 5:50, sitting on the hood of her car, which she'd pulled forward to the edge where the lot met a narrow strip of grass and chain-link fence, and beyond the fence a 2-lane road that would start seeing delivery trucks in about an hour. She had a coffee from the ED break room. The good kind. Someone had made a fresh pot at some point in the last half hour, and she had taken a cup without asking, which was the kind of thing you could do when you were reinstated. She was reinstated. The badge in her pocket, the new one, temporary, issued by the security desk at 3:45 a.m., felt strange in the same way that familiar things feel strange after you've had them taken away and then gotten them back. The same object, different weight. Her phone had been active for the last hour with messages she'd been managing in between moments. Raymond, confirming the federal attorneys would want her at his office at 10 a.m. Terrell, telling her the department was stable and she should sleep before coming back. Her sister in Portland, who had somehow found out something was happening and sent 3 increasingly worried texts, the last of which just said, "Call me." She would call her later. She heard footsteps on the pavement and didn't need to look to know it was Fane. He had a particular walk, not loud, but purposeful, the kind that announces presence without announcing itself. He sat on the hood of the car beside her with the ease of a man who doesn't require invitation. He had a coffee, too, from somewhere. They sat in parallel and looked at the fence and the road beyond it. "Bevins is cooperating," Fane said. "He confirmed the breach was deliberate. He's naming a second contact at the facility, someone who helped him access the containment controls. So it's not just him." 2 people decided 40 casualties was worth protecting their end of a fraud, she said. "People make those calculations more than you'd think. They just usually don't use the words." He drank his coffee. "The DODIG office is expanding the investigation to the other hospital systems Wilms mentioned. I'm going to be involved for the next several weeks." A pause. "They may want you as a consultant." She looked at him sideways. "In what capacity?" The supply diversion scheme exploited gaps in how hospitals report emergency preparedness inventories to federal oversight. You identified the gap through direct clinical observation. That's a different kind of expertise than what the investigators have. He paused. "Your background doesn't hurt either." "My background isn't public." "No, but it's documented where it needs to be." He glanced at her. "It would be paid. It would be properly structured, and you could keep your position here if the board offers one." She thought about that. The shape of it. The possibility that the things she'd spent the last 6 years quietly doing, building a life that was smaller than what she'd come from, more contained, less exposed, might not be the only option. "I'll think about it," she said. He accepted that without pushing, which was one of the things she had always respected about him. They sat for another minute in the gray morning quiet. Then Fain said, "You should know. Stote's attorney called the IG office at 4:30 this morning. She's preparing to argue that his actions were within the scope of legitimate financial management decisions, and that the federal filings were errors of documentation rather than intentional fraud." "She's good," Mara said. "She is. The problem for her is the manifest with his signature, and Pruitt's financial records, and now Bevan's, who is going to put a human body count next to Stote's decision-making in a way that makes the documentation argument very difficult to sustain." Fain's voice stayed even. "It won't be fast. These things are never fast, but the outcome is not in serious doubt." She thought about Delgado, the man with the burned hands who hadn't made it. She thought about Teruko's oxygen saturation numbers climbing back toward acceptable and her voice asking about her kids. She thought about Vasquez asking which one and nodding with his eyes at the ceiling. "It's not enough," she said. "It wasn't a complaint. It was just accurate." "No," Fain agreed. "It never quite is." The first delivery truck appeared on the road beyond the fence. Morning was committing now, the gray warming fractionally, a few birds somewhere doing what birds did at this hour in November. Her phone buzzed, a number she didn't recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail, but something about the timing made her answer. "Ms. Voss?" A woman's voice, professional, measured. "My name is Adrian Solt. I'm with the Department of Defense Office of the Inspector General. I apologize for the hour." A brief pause. "We've been reviewing the background documentation that General Fain submitted this evening in connection with the Callaway investigation." Mara went still. "I'm aware of who you are, Ms. Voss," Solt continued. "Or I should say, I'm aware of your full record. The record that Callaway Medical Center was not aware of when they hired you, and not aware of when they terminated you." "What about it?" Mara said. Her voice was steady. Fain was watching her now from 2 feet away. "Several things," Solt said. "But the immediate matter is this. The investigation you participated in tonight, and I'm using that word deliberately because what you did was considerably more than observe, has surfaced connections to a network that goes beyond these hospital systems. We believe the contractor network that purchased the diverted supplies has links to an organized medical supply black market that's been operating for approximately 4 years." A pause. "We've been building a case. Tonight gave us the piece we were missing." Mara looked at the fence. The delivery truck was past it now, moving on down the road. "And?" she said. "And one of the individuals in that network, a logistics coordinator whose name came up in Pruitt's financial records tonight, someone we have been watching for 8 months, filed a movement report 6 hours ago." A pause that was just long enough. "He's in Drennan Falls, arrived this morning. 40 minutes ago, he entered Callaway Medical Center." The silence lasted 2 seconds. "He's still in the building," Mara said. "We believe so, yes," Solt said. "And Ms. Voss, he has no idea that Pruitt has given us his name." She was off the hood of the car before Solt finished the sentence. "How many agents do you have in the area?" she said. 2 in transit, 12 minutes out." Solt's voice stayed measured, the particular calm of someone who has run operations before and knows that calm is load-bearing in these moments. "We have building security on alert, but we haven't moved on them yet. We don't want him spooked before our people are in position." "Who is he?" "His name is Roland Kask, 47. He operates as a medical supply logistics consultant, legitimate business front, incorporated in 3 states. The contractor network that bought from Pruitt runs through 2 of his shell companies." A pause. "He's not a violent actor by profile, but he's been operating this network for 4 years, which means he's experienced at knowing when a situation has compromised, and if he's here in person, arriving this morning after Pruitt's arrest last night, he may already know." Fain had moved off the hood and was standing beside her, She put Solt on speaker without asking permission. "He's here to clean something," Fane said. Not a question. "That's our assessment," Solt said. "There may be physical documentation, contracts, transaction records that weren't fully digitized, that he's attempting to retrieve or destroy before the investigation expands." "Where in the building?" Mara said. Last camera position was the main lobby, 6:22 a.m. He signed in as a vendor representative. The name on the visitor log is false. We confirmed that 4 minutes ago. Mara looked at Fane. He was already on his phone with his other hand, talking to someone in the clipped shorthand of military communication. She thought about the building's layout, the lobby, the corridors, the places where physical records lived. Administration was on level 4, mostly cleared now. Medical records was level 2, East Wing. Supply chain management had a physical archive in the basement, a room she had been in exactly twice, once for an orientation tour 6 years ago, and once when she'd gone looking for historical inventory records during the initial supply discrepancy investigation 3 weeks ago. "Basement," she said. "Supply chain archive. If he knows this hospital's structure, and if Pruitt briefed him at any point on where physical documentation was maintained, that's where he goes." "That's a reasonable inference," Solt said. "It's more than inference. The transaction records Pruitt kept copies of, the ones he had in his personal storage unit, those were copies. The originals were physical, stamped procurement documents that would have been filed in the supply chain archive as part of the standard vendor record system." She was already moving toward the hospital entrance. "Pruitt told me, indirectly in how he described the scheme, that the original paperwork went through normal channels. If Caskey knows Pruitt is cooperating, he knows those originals are a liability." Fane fell into step beside her, into his own phone. "Get me 2 people to the basement level, supply chain corridor. Non-tactical entry, plain clothes if available. We do not want this person alarmed before we have coverage on all exits." A pause. "Yes, now," Solt said through Mara's phone. "Ms. Voss, I need to be direct with you. This is a federal operation. Your role here—" "I know the building," Mara said. "Your agents don't. Give me 12 minutes. A pause that was exactly long enough to mean Solt was deciding something. "Do not engage him," Solt said. "Do not identify yourself. If you locate him, you call me and you wait." "Understood," Mara said. She went through the lobby doors. The day shift was beginning to stir. The morning intake coordinator was at the admissions desk, a different security officer at the main station, a pair of nurses from the night shift heading toward the exit, with the particular flat-eyed exhaustion of people who have worked through something difficult and are now purely focused on reaching their cars. The lobby had the specific quality of early morning in an institution, not rested, just reset. The visitor log was on the desk near the main security station. Mara walked to it with the confidence of a reinstated employee who had a legitimate reason to be anywhere in this building, picked it up, and looked at the entry from 6:22 a.m. The name Caskey had used was Denton Marsh, listed as a vendor representative from a medical equipment company whose name Mara didn't recognize but filed away. The destination line said, "Supply Chain, Level B1. She set the log down and walked to the elevator. The basement of Callaway Medical Center was not the kind of space the hospital showed to donors or featured in its annual report. It was functional and unglamorous. Concrete floors, utility lighting, the hum of HVAC systems doing the essential, unappreciated work of keeping the floors above operational. The supply chain archive was at the far end of the main basement corridor, past the biomedical equipment room and the linen services station, behind a fire door that required a keycard. Her keycard worked. The reinstatement had been entered into the system, the access restored to its original parameters, and she felt the small, solid click of the lock releasing and was aware of what it meant beyond the mechanical, this building opening to her again, acknowledging her in the basic language of systems. She went through the door quietly. The archive room had a light on, not the full overhead fluorescence, the task lighting at the far end of the shelving rows, the kind you'd use if you were trying to look at specific documents without turning on everything and announcing yourself to the corridor. She didn't go in. She stayed in the doorway and listened. Drawer opening, the specific metallic sound of a filing cabinet, The resistance and slide of a drawer that doesn't move as smoothly as it once did. Then the sound of paper, not reading, flipping. Someone moving through files quickly with the focused speed of a person who knows roughly what they're looking for and needs to find it before they run out of time. She put her phone to her ear and called Solt. One ring. "He's in the basement archive room," she said, barely above a breath. "B1, supply chain corridor, end of the hall past the fire door. He's in the filing section. Hasn't heard me." "Oh, agents are 4 minutes out," Solt said, equally quiet. "Do not go into that room." She stayed in the doorway. Through the gap, she could see the edge of one shelving unit and a sliver of the far wall. She couldn't see Kask, but she could track him by sound. The continued movement through files, a drawer closing, another one opening. He was working efficiently and without particular urgency, which meant he didn't know yet. He thought he had time. 3 minutes felt like considerably longer. She stood in the doorway with the phone against her thigh and tracked his sounds and thought about nothing that wasn't immediate and operational. Then she heard a second sound, not from inside the room, from behind her in the corridor. Footsteps, but wrong. Too deliberate. Someone trying to be quiet and not quite succeeding, with the particular cadence of a person who isn't trained for this. She turned. Pamela Greer was standing 10 feet behind her in the corridor. She had clearly come down from above, was slightly winded, and was holding her phone with both hands. Her face was the face of a woman who has made a decision and arrived at its consequence. Mara held up one hand. "Stop." Pamela stopped. She pointed at her own phone, then at the room, then shook her head once. "Don't speak." Pamela understood. She nodded. She held up her own phone, turned the screen toward Mara. There was a text on it, timestamped 4 minutes ago, from a number labeled HS, Harlan Stote. It read, "He's going to pull the Kellner contracts. If those leave the building, we lose the third system link. Make sure he gets out." Mara looked at it. She looked at Pamela. She read what was on Pamela's face. The specific quality of someone who has received a message from a person they are now terrified to be associated with, and has come here not to help Kasky, but to show someone the text before it could be deleted. She held out her hand for the phone. Pamela gave it to her. She forwarded the text to Solt's number. Then she handed the phone back. 30 seconds later, Solt in her ear. "Got it. That establishes Stote directing obstruction from outside the building after his board removal. That's a new charge." A brief pause. "Agents are in the building. 90 seconds. Mara looked at Pamela and pointed back the way she'd come. "Go back upstairs." Pamela hesitated. Mara pointed again, with the particular quality of authority that doesn't invite negotiation. Pamela went. The sound from the archive room changed. The filing drawer closed. Footsteps, moving toward the door. Mara stepped back into the corridor, 3 paces to the left, positioning herself beside the shelving unit that ran along the corridor wall. Not hiding. There was no time for hiding, and it would have looked wrong anyway. Just not in the direct sightline of the door. Roland Kasky came through the archive room door at 6:41 in the morning carrying a manila folder approximately 2 inches thick. He was medium height, with the unremarkable face of a man who had spent 4 years being professionally invisible. He wore a visitor badge clipped to a jacket that cost more than the jacket was performing. He pulled the fire door shut behind him with the ease of someone who had been here before, or somewhere enough like it. He looked up and saw her. She was standing in the corridor of a hospital she worked in scrubs that she had been wearing for going on 15 hours, with a temporary access badge clipped to her chest and the look of someone who belongs absolutely where they are standing. She nodded at him with the brief professional acknowledgement of passing staff, the universal hospital gesture that means, "I see you and am not concerned about you." He nodded back, started walking toward the elevator. She let him get 4 steps. Then the stairwell door at the far end of the corridor opened and 2 people in plain clothes with federal ID badges on chains walked through it, and behind them one of Fane's officers in uniform, and the corridor became a different kind of space instantaneously. Kasky stopped. He assessed the corridor in the single quick scan of someone who has been in bad situations before. He looked at the 3 people coming from the stairwell. He looked back at Mara. He looked at the folder in his hands with the specific expression of a man doing a very fast calculation about what it would mean to run versus what it would mean to not run. He didn't run. He was experienced, which meant he understood that running in a basement corridor with no exits other than the stairwell and elevator was not running so much as it was deferring the same outcome by 30 seconds. Agent Reyes said, "Mr. Kask, put the folder on the floor." Kasky looked at him. He looked at the folder. He set it on the floor with the deliberate care of a man who is trying to demonstrate in real time that he is a reasonable person who cooperates with authority, an impression he was going to need very badly in the coming months. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said. "That's possible," Reyes said pleasantly. "We'll talk about it upstairs." But the sun was fully up by the time Mara came back out of the building. 7:15, the November light still thin and pale, but committed now, doing what it could with the industrial skyline of Drennan Falls. She sat on a bench near the hospital's main entrance, an actual bench, the kind placed for patients waiting for rides, metal and cold and not particularly comfortable. She sat on it anyway. She was holding her phone but not looking at it. She was looking at the parking lot, at the morning shift arriving in their cars, at the ordinary movement of a hospital returning to its daytime rhythm, the rhythm it maintained regardless of what had happened the night before. Because hospitals don't pause, they don't take stock. They just continue, patient by patient, hour by hour, in the fundamental stubborn insistence of a place built to hold the worst moments of people's lives and keep going. She had built her life here on purpose, not because it was the only place she could have gone, but because it was where she had chosen to go, away from the other thing, the classified thing, the years that had given her a specific set of skills and a specific set of scars and a specific understanding of what she was willing to do and what it cost. She had wanted something quieter, something where the victories, small as they were, could be held in both hands and looked at. She had not entirely gotten that, but she had gotten something. Terrell came out at 7:20. He had his jacket on and his bag over his shoulder. End of shift, finally, and he sat down next to her on the cold bench without being invited, which was a reasonable thing to do after the night they'd had. "Go home," he said. "In a minute. The department's fine. Day shift is briefed. Vasquez is off critical monitoring." He paused. "Taruko asked about you, the woman from Hartwell, the one you caught." "What did she ask?" "She asked if you were okay." He said it simply, without embellishment. Mara felt that land somewhere in her chest, not dramatically, just the quiet particular weight of it. A woman who had almost died because of a deliberate explosion and a dangerously under-resourced hospital, asking in the morning if the nurse who caught her deterioration was okay. "Tell her yes," Mara said. Terrell nodded. He sat for another moment. "I've been here 9 years," he said. "I've seen people get pushed out. It happens in hospitals like this. People who see things, who won't bend, who make it harder for administration to operate in the gray areas. They usually don't come back." He looked at his hands. "I watched you walk out yesterday, and I didn't stop it. I want to say I was going to do something and just needed time, but I don't actually know if that's true." She considered that. It was honest, which she valued more than the comfortable version. "You documented everything in your scope," she said. "The audit trail you helped pull tonight. That was the thing that got Norris. That mattered. It's not the same as speaking up." "No," she agreed. "It's not." She paused. "But you get more than one night to figure out who you are." He stood. He picked up his bag. He looked at her once more with the eyes of someone who had filed something important and would return to it. "Get some sleep," he said. "You too." He walked to the parking lot. She watched him go. Raymond's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown that smelled like carpet and coffee and the specific institutional ambition of a mid-sized city's legal sector. She arrived at 10 a.m., having slept for exactly 2 hours on the couch in the physician's lounge, which was not restful, but was something. Raymond was waiting with 2 federal attorneys from the IG's office and Adrienne Solt, who turned out to be shorter than she'd sounded on the phone and considerably more observant. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Mara gave her statement with the precision she gave everything, sequential, specific, without editorializing, with documentation attached to every factual claim. The federal attorneys asked follow-up questions. Solt mostly listened and occasionally wrote things down. At the end of the third hour, one of the attorneys, a woman named Prasad, who had the compact efficiency of someone who had been doing this for 15 years, said, "Your report from 3 weeks ago is the foundational document for this entire case. Without it, the timeline of the supply diversion doesn't have an independent anchor. What you filed, when you filed it, establishes that the fraud was ongoing and actively covered up." Mara said, "I know." Prasad looked at her. "I'm saying this because sometimes witnesses don't understand the weight of what they contributed. You should." Raymond, across the table, had the expression of a man who is pleased and trying not to show it too demonstrably. "There are also," Solt said, "going to be questions about your background, your prior service record. The investigation is going to become public. It already is. Media inquiries started hitting the IG's press office at 8 this morning. And when it does, your name is going to be in it." "I'm aware," Mara said. "Your service record is classified at a level that protects the operational specifics. But the fact of your service, your field medical role, your commendations, those can be acknowledged without compromising anything." Solt paused. "We would like to acknowledge them, with your permission." Mara was quiet for a moment. She thought about the years she had not talked about, the specific weight of carrying them privately. Not as a burden, exactly, more as a dimension of herself that she'd kept folded and stored because the context for unfolding it hadn't existed in civilian life. She had not needed the acknowledgement, but there was a difference between not needing something and refusing it when the purpose was legitimate. "Yes," she said. "You can acknowledge them." Boom. The public accounting came in stages, the way these things always do. The federal charges against Harlan Stote were filed 8 days after the night of the Hartwell incident. Fraud. Conspiracy to commit fraud. Theft of federal emergency resources. Obstruction of justice. The charge added after Solt's team confirmed the text to Pamela Greer directing Cascade to remove the documents. The charges were filed in federal district court, and the filing was public, which meant by noon that day, every local news outlet in the county had the name and the specifics, and the number. $800,000 in stolen medical supplies, 14 months, 1 fatality connected to the resulting resource shortage. Delgado's family appeared in the reporting. His wife gave a brief statement to a local reporter. She didn't want the spotlight, she made that clear, but she wanted his name said correctly, which it was. Dale Pruitt's cooperation agreement was formalized 12 days later. He received reduced charges in exchange for full testimony against Stote, Norris, and Caskey, and a complete accounting of the network's operations. His testimony added 3 additional hospital systems to the investigation and identified 7 individual contractors. It was, in the assessment of Prasad's team, the most comprehensive unraveling of a medical supply fraud network the IG's office had encountered in a decade. Kenneth Norris, the CFO, did not cooperate. He went to trial. His attorney made the argument that the attempted pharmaceutical record insertion was a panicked individual act, not part of the broader conspiracy, and the jury considered this for 4 days before convicting on 2 of the 3 counts. He was sentenced the following spring. Roland Caskey's case took longer. The multi-state logistics network required coordination across 3 federal jurisdictions. But the Kellner contracts in the folder he'd been carrying when Reyes stopped him turned out to be exactly what Solt's team needed to connect the distribution side of the operation to the procurement side. Caskey's attorney tried 3 times to get the evidence suppressed. All 3 attempts failed. Harlan Stote's trial was the last to conclude, and the longest. His attorney was good, as everyone had acknowledged, and she fought every element of the prosecution's case with the controlled ferocity of someone being paid a great deal of money to make the documented past feel ambiguous. She couldn't make $800,000 in signed transfer orders ambiguous. She couldn't make Dale Pruitt's testimony ambiguous. And she could not make the jury in Drennan Falls look at the name Delgado and the evidence connecting his death to a resource shortage created by deliberate fraud, and find ambiguity there either. Guilty on all counts. The sentencing came in late spring, and the number was significant. And when it was announced in the courtroom, Stote sat with the expression of a man who had told himself for a very long time that consequences were things that happened to people less capable than himself. Mara wasn't in the courtroom. She was at work. Try it. Callaway Medical Center's emergency preparedness overhaul began the week after the board voted to bring Mara on as interim director of emergency preparedness, while a national search was conducted for a permanent appointment. The board made the interim designation official and public, which was its own form of statement. The first thing she did was audit every supply cabinet, every emergency kit, every inventory record in the building against the actual physical stock. It took 4 days with a team of 6, and what they found was consistent with what she'd already known. The building was running on significantly less than it claimed, with gaps distributed across multiple departments in the specific pattern of a systematic long-term diversion. She documented all of it. Every gap, every discrepancy, every item. She did it in writing. She did it with photographs. She submitted it to the board and to the Federal Compliance Office simultaneously, and then she submitted a budget request for full remediation restock that was large enough to make the CFO's interim replacement wince. The board approved it in full. She hired Preeta as a permanent ED staff nurse. Preeta had been on contract and the contract was about to lapse, and Mara made the case to Renfield, who had been appointed interim CEO, while the board conducted a leadership search in about 6 sentences. Renfield approved it the same afternoon. She didn't hire back everyone. Some of the staff who had turned away in the lobby when the security guards walked her out were still there, still doing their jobs, and she worked with them the way she had always worked, professionally, without warmth she didn't feel yet, which was honest. Trust is not restored because circumstances change. It's rebuilt, slowly, in the way of all things that require time. Terrell she trusted. Della, who had brought her coffee and meant it, she was watching. Santos, who had held her eyes in the corridor and said, "I know," without saying anything. Santos, she had specifically requested remain on her shift rotation. These were small things. They were not small things. 3 weeks after the night at Hartwell, she drove to the county hospital to see Taruko. It wasn't required. It wasn't part of any follow-up protocol. She went because she wanted to, which was a reason she had learned, slowly over many years, to take seriously. Taruko was in a regular room by then, the oxygen cannula gone, sitting up with a book open on her lap that she wasn't reading. Her kids were visiting. The 7-year-old had fallen asleep on the chair by the window in the particular collapsed way of children who fight sleep and then lose completely, and the 9-year-old was doing something on a tablet with headphones on. Taruko looked up when Mara appeared in the doorway, and something moved across her face. "You came," she said. "I said I'd come," Mara said. She hadn't, actually, but she had thought it clearly enough that it felt like a commitment. Taruko looked at her kids. She looked at Mara. She said, "The news. They said the hospital didn't have the right supplies, that if the military hadn't brought their own, we had enough," Mara said. It was true, and it was also not the complete answer, but the complete answer served no one right now. Taruko looked at her steadily. She was not a woman who missed things. "But only barely," she said. "Only barely," Mara agreed. Taruko nodded slowly. She absorbed that the way adults absorb difficult truths, not easily, not without cost, but with the particular dignity of someone who would rather know. "Thank you," she said, "for catching what you caught." The 9-year-old pulled off a headphone to look at the newcomer in the doorway. "Are you the nurse?" she said. "Yes," Mara said. The girl looked at her with the frank assessment of a child who hasn't yet learned to soften her evaluations. "Mom said you were really good at your job." Mara looked at the girl. She thought about the right response and discarded a few before arriving at the honest one. "I've had a lot of practice," she said. Adrienne Solt called on a Tuesday morning in December with the things she'd been referencing since the parking lot conversation. The DoD Inspector General's office was forming a multi-agency working group on emergency preparedness compliance fraud. The Callaway case had expanded to 9 hospital systems across 4 states. The working group needed people who understood both the clinical side, what the gaps actually meant for patient outcomes, and the operational side, what the supply chains looked like from inside an institution that was being systematically compromised. Mara's name had been formally recommended by Fain, by Solt's team, and by Prasad's prosecution office. The appointment was civilian, advisory, voluntary, in the sense that everything advisory is technically voluntary. "We'd need you approximately 1 week a month," Solt said. "Travel to Washington, sometimes regional. You could maintain your position at Callaway." "I know," Mara said. She had been thinking about the call since it was first mentioned. She had thought about it in the parking lot that November morning, and in Raymond's conference room, and during the 4 days of supply auditing, and in small, quiet moments between shifts when the question would surface, and she'd look at it, and put it back, and look at it again. She thought about what it meant, not in terms of title or recognition, but in terms of use. The specific thing she knew how to do, applied at the scale where it could stop something before it became the night at Hartwell, before it became 41 casualties and 1 fatality, and a family asking a reporter to please say his name correctly. "Yes," she said. "I'll do it." The Department of Defense held a formal acknowledgement ceremony in Washington in January. It was not a public spectacle. These things rarely were when classified service was adjacent. 30 people in a room, most of them in uniform, a few in suits, Mara in the dark jacket she'd bought the week before because Raymond had told her to buy something that wasn't scrubs. General Douglas Fain presented the commendation. It cited her field medical service in terms that were specific enough to be meaningful and general enough to protect what needed protecting. It cited the Callaway case. It cited her role in the working group's formation. He handed her the commendation in its formal case, and then, because they had known each other through things that don't translate into ceremony, he shook her hand and held it for a moment and said quietly, so only she heard, "You should have gotten this years ago." "I wasn't ready for it then," she said. That was true, not because she hadn't earned it, but because she hadn't yet understood how to carry public acknowledgement without letting it tell her who she was. Who she was had been decided in rooms and fields and corridors and emergency departments, in the accumulated specific weight of work done when it was difficult and when no one was watching and when the outcome wasn't guaranteed. The commendation didn't change that. It confirmed it, which was a different thing. There was a small reception afterward, and she stood with a glass of water talking to a DOD physician she'd be working with on the compliance project. And outside the windows, Washington in January was gray and cold and looked like a city that carried the weight of its own importance somewhat earnestly. She thought about Drennan Falls, about the hospital, about the morning shift starting right now without her, Terrell probably on charge, Preeta covering the trauma bays, the monitors doing their steady, undemonstrative work. She thought about what it meant to be a person who kept showing up for something that didn't always show up for her in return. Institutions are not loyal. She had understood this before Callaway and had the lesson sharpened considerably at Callaway and would understand it differently again in the years ahead. They are built by people and they reflect the people who build them, which means they contain always the full range of what people are capable of. The Stoats and the Norrises, yes, but also the Terrells and the Preetas and the Dellas who bring coffee at 2 a.m. because they want to do something useful and have worked out that this is what's available. You don't give up on institutions. You stay inside them and you push. And sometimes you get pushed back out, and sometimes you get walked through the lobby by security guards while patients watch in silence. And you say you're making a mistake and nobody listens, and then you go sit in your car for 11 minutes and you process the shock and you decide that the shock is not the end of anything. That is the only honest version of this story. Not the version where the right person wins because the universe is just, but the version where the right person keeps working because the work matters, and the alternative is letting the Stoats of the world have the field entirely. She had not saved everyone. She had lost Delgado. She had been complicit by proximity in a system that had been failing its patients for 14 months before she had documentation sufficient to trigger a response. She had made errors in the night of the Hartwell response. 2 decisions she'd reviewed afterward that she would make differently. She carried those things without dramatizing them, which was the only honest way to carry them. What she had also done, she had filed the report. She had said, "You're making a mistake," and meant it, and been right. She had worked through 5 hours of mass casualty intake on a Thursday night after being fired, because the patients didn't care who had fired her, and neither did she. She had stood in a corridor at 2 in the morning and told a man in a hospital bed which of his coworkers hadn't made it, because he deserved to know, and truth is its own form of respect. She had done the work, not gracefully, not without cost, not in the smooth narrative arc of a story where justice moves in straight lines. In the actual complicated human way, full of exhaustion and second-guessing and paper cups of bad coffee and a temporary access badge that felt strange in her pocket for a week before it felt like hers again. Salt appeared beside her at the reception and said something about the working group's first meeting in February. Logistics. Which building? Which day? Mara answered the logistics questions. She looked out the window at the gray January city and thought about the bronze plaque the hospital board had voted to install in the lobby of Callaway Medical Center. She had argued against it, briefly and without much conviction, and the board had overruled her, which was one of the more pleasant times she'd been overruled. The plaque read, Mara Voss, R.N. In recognition of service to this institution, this community, and the patients who deserved better than they received here. We will do better. She had stood in the lobby and read those last 4 words for a long time. We will do better. Not we have done well. Not a celebration of what the institution was, but an acknowledgement of what it owed, and a commitment made in public and in metal where it couldn't be quietly revised. It wasn't enough, but it was not nothing. She finished the glass of water. She said something to Salt about February. She looked at the gray sky over the city, and then she looked at her phone where there was a text from Terrell that said, Vasquez stopped by today, brought food for the department, wanted to know if you were coming back Thursday. She typed back, tell him yes. She put her phone in her pocket. She stood in a room full of people who had finally learned what she was, and she thought about the quiet years of being something that nobody around her could see, and she thought about the lobby of a hospital in Drennan Falls, and the particular sound of doors closing behind you, and she thought about the strange, durable thing that happens to people who keep doing the right thing in the dark. Not the recognition, which comes or doesn't come, and cannot be the reason, but the knowledge itself, the simple, unassailable knowledge of what you did and why. That knowledge had been there the whole time. It hadn't needed a ceremony. But she was glad, finally, that the room knew too.